Good evening. Tonight we celebrate the beginning of a new academic year with the opening of a comprehensive exhibition of Stanley Tigerman's half-century career as an architect and a talk by Mr. Tigerman. The exhibition, Ceci n'est pas une reverie, not said as well as by our Professor Petit, is curated by Professor Emmanuel Petit. And it marks the transfer of Tigerman's complete drawing archive to Yale in 2012, where over 260 individual architecture, exhibition, and design projects will be available to students and scholars for future study. Following its inaugural presentation here at Yale, the Tigerman exhibition will travel to the Graham Foundation's Madlener House Galleries in Chicago, and then on to the University of Illinois at Champaign. I wish to acknowledge the support of the Graham Foundation and to welcome its director, Sarah Herda, who is here with us tonight, I believe, although I haven't seen her. But Sarah, where are you? Is she here? Maybe not. Or in the other room, that could be possible, but she knew the rules. And there are as well staff from the foundation and very many friends of Mr. Tigerman's, whom, of course, we welcome enthusiastically to Yale. I also wish to acknowledge the support of Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown in helping making this exhibition a reality, and to thank former exhibitions director Dean Sakamoto for his collaborative work with Emmanuel Petit in designing the show. Also not to be overlooked is our former exhibitions coordinator, Dana Keaton, who has relocated to Arizona. But I also want to thank gallery registrar Linda Thatcher-Vischer and curatorial assistant, Linda is still with us, I'm happy to say, and curatorial assistant David Reinhardt, who was MED 2011, for their great good work. David worked tirelessly and imaginatively with Emmanuel in working through the archives of the Tigerman office and putting together the amazing compilation that you see in the galleries. As well, I offer kudos to Karen Carter-Lynch of Chicago for the excellent film conversation with Stanley that was made for this exhibition and is on view in the gallery. And I urge you to take a few minutes after the lecture during the cocktail hour to stand in front of the screen and see Stanley on that beautifully put together film. It's my pleasure also to welcome Brian Butterfield, a recent graduate of our school who has joined our faculty as exhibitions director, and to draw your attention to Emmanuel Petit's work as editor of a collection of Stanley Tigerman's writings that has just been published by the Yale Press. Copies of the book, which is titled Schlepping Through Ambivalence, Essays on an American Architectural Condition, will be on sale in our gallery during the reception that will follow tonight's lecture, and Stanley Tigerman has graciously agreed to sign copies after you've paid for them. Also on sale in the gallery at the same time this evening will be copies of Designing Bridges to Burn, Architectural Memoirs of Stanley Tigerman, which has just been published by Oro Editions. He will sign those if you buy them. Stanley Tigerman's lecture is the 28th Paul Rudolph Lecture. The Rudolph Lectures were endowed by Mr. and Mrs. Moritz B. Edersheim to honor the architect of the building in which some of us sit, Summer and Gloria. To the Edersheims and many of us in this room tonight, including our speaker, Paul Rudolph was a great architect and a great friend. The Edersheims have been wonderfully kind to the school in another way, endowing a publication fund in Paul Rudolph's memory. From 1958 to 1965, Paul Rudolph was chairman of the Department of Architecture in what was then the Yale School of Art and Architecture. Under his leadership, the school reached new heights of influence as a center of professional training and design inquiry, attracting brilliant students who went on to brilliant careers. One of the brightest and most talented of these was Stanley Tigerman, who, though already a certified professional architect with an established career in Chicago offices such as Keck and Keck and Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, as well as a fledgling independent practice, decided to come to New Haven to study because of Paul Rudolph. I'm sure Stanley will tell you more about that. Rudolph, in turn, ranked Stanley Tigerman among his most brilliant students, and I can tell you that. This is not Stanley bragging, but I've heard it from Paul Rudolph over and over again, and close professional and personal friends. So to have Stanley deliver the Rudolph lecture tonight seems particularly fitting. I was a beginning student in the school when Stanley was blazing his way through what was then the master's class. Tigerman not only impressed Rudolph and visiting critics like Philip Johnson, Gordon Bunshaft, and James Sterling, but almost all of the students in the school who were in awe of his talent, his energy, and his commitment to excellence. Since that time, Stanley hasn't changed, I'm happy to say, except in one significant way. Adding to his accomplishments as an architect, he has added a dimension of public responsibility that is rare in our profession. Stanley is not only a distinguished architect, but a man with a mission. From his perch in America's second city, Stanley enjoys an international reputation as designer and public scold. I had to say that about Second City. You knew that I would say that.
What else is new?
What else is new? Exactly. Stanley enjoys an international reputation as a designer and a public scold, using his formidable skill as a draftsman, cartoonist, and writer to help keep the profession on its best behavior, and that's a full-time job in and of itself. In a profession where leaders seldom have many nice things to say about each other, virtually all who have known Stanley Tigerman and his work agree he is a force majeure. He is a mensch. Please join me in welcoming Stanley Tigerman as he delivers tonight's Paul Rudolph lecture, Displacement. Stanley.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay. Of course, I have a number of thank yous as well before I begin. But of course, primarily to Bob, who has been a great support and a great and dear friend for this half century. I also want to thank Michelle Comey of Yale Press, who's here, without whom the book, no thanks to Peter Eisenman, Schlepping Through Ambivalence, would not have occurred. He was against the title. It's a little too Jewish for Peter, but you get my drift. But my sincerest and deepest thanks go to Emmanuel Petit, without whom none of this would have transpired. To have somebody with a perceivable IQ behave as he's done in expressing an idea of an other, to use Emmanuel Levinas's term, as succinctly as he's done, is extraordinary. And I owe him a huge debt of thanks. I also want to, this is actually highly emotional, I really also want to dedicate this talk to Doug Garofalo, who died in Chicago 25 days ago, one day shy of his 53rd birthday, which is, to say the least, tragic. Okay, in any case, on with the show. I decided to do something tonight, which I've given a hell of a lot of thought to, that is normally not done by architects. That is to try and express what it is that I've tried to do throughout my career. So I'm showing a number of images that actually are directed at different strategies about the word displacement. And I want to begin with the images on the screen. In the 12th century, an Andalusian polymath, philosopher, and medical doctor named Ibn Tufayl wrote the only document that's come down through the centuries to us, which is called Hayy ibn Yaqzan, which you see here, which is the image on your left. It's an incredible philosophic tale about a feral autodidact who, abandoned by his mother, almost in a mosaic kind of story, on a raft set adrift in the Arabian Sea, ends up on an island and is raised by an animal, by a deer, a doe. Years go by, and the doe nurtures and loves him in the way that only a mother could do. But at some point, of course, the deer gets frail, gets ill, and then dies. Stunned, he tries to ascertain the source of her love for him. And in the process, not finding it, he dissects her, which is the image on your right. And putting aside the organs, all that he finds left is the emptiness of the cavity, the thorax, which is in each of us, which is about, in a sense, the absence of presence. And thus begins the story of someone seeking what John Hayek referred to as aura, what in the book Tufayl refers to as the soul, but is really about ineffability, the unspeakable, the unutterable, which in architecture is referred to often as the poetic. We tend not to talk about the poetic in architecture because it's something that can only be experienced, that you can only engage in, but you really can't talk about. So this is the beginning of my search for the ineffable and how I've gone about the business of doing it. In religion, of course, the slide on the top is of the Kaaba in Mecca, which is a cube around which during a Hajj, circumnavigating it 7 times, the faithful are, at least one time in their life, are supposed to do. The image below it, of course, is the empty tomb of Jesus Christ. So they're both spaces, and that question of the displacement of what was once filled, which once held the body of Jesus Christ, the emptiness of the Kaaba, and given that architecture's history from Hellenic Christian origins on forward, found their way in the 10th century into the slide on the lower left being a French Cistercian monastery. Above it is the monastery at Cologne. The other 2 are Wells and Durham, the cathedrals in England. So there is an incredible history of trying to find that absent center, the axis mundi that points toward heaven. And it's a part of our tradition. And it's had a huge impact on me as well, as the next slide will show, which is the cloister of the project I did in Fukuoka on the South Island of Kyushu in 1991. So it's not only sacred space, but it's also profane space as well. This was my entry to a competition for an interfaith, multi-denominational space that was to be in San Francisco, and its purpose of being round in a way is all of the 12 faiths depicted there or are oriented correctly. Vis-a-vis, you enter the via Cistercian monastic precedent, you enter the cathedral from the west, you enter the Jewish temple east, east, south, east, and similarly on the other side of the circle, the Islamic one is entered the same way. So there was a correctness implicit in the orientation, but that attempt to continuously seek that which has been displaced and ending up as space has been a part of my search as well. Because the purpose of this talk is actually, since I see architecture if you will, as a communicable disease. I'm interested in conveying, and I'm happy to convey, that which motivated me throughout time. This is the cloister of the largest, longest running homeless shelter in the United States, the Pacific Garden Mission in Chicago, also oriented correctly. The plan which is above it, the chapel, is entered from the west, is oriented to the east. You're supposed to die in the body and blood of Christ. And the square residual space is marked by 12 trees, representing the 12 tribes, etc. So all of that has had a huge impact on my life. And to the point, I started making drawings. This is a sketch of another approach to the search for ineffability, if you will, which is what I will call lateral displacement, which you see on the extreme left, the Torah, which is that incredible document that you actually handle as you peel it aside to read the text. So it's been throughout history. You see at the end of the Sikh, on the way to the treasury at Petra, the rock actually exposing slowly what was ineffable to that at the time. And then, of course, there's the Torah itself. This incredible document. Everything, the earlier slides about space is of Christian Hellenic origin. For the Jews, it was a study of the book of the people of the book. So in other words, the text, which in turn is encoded because only the consonants are there. So it starts with the Torah, this pulling back to reveal ineffability. And then in 1550, you find in Tivoli the Villa d'Este by Piero Ligorio, which nature has been pulled back and water courses down the center of the villa atop of that slope. So that interest was always there. And of course, then with Thomas Jefferson, it's interesting. I had a long talk with the great Jefferson scholar at the University of Virginia about this. Jefferson, when he designed the University of Virginia, before his influence by Benjamin Latrobe, before his influence by Palladio after going to Europe, and aside from his interest in books, qua books, designed the original plan of the university as 4 parallel bars. In other words, something that was in perpetuity open. And you can read about the dramatic thing that must have been in Tafuri's book on utopia, where Tafuri talks about this incredible exercise in democracy that America represented, and that Jefferson tried to capture in these 4 parallel bars. Later, after the influence of Latrobe going to Europe, of course he put a headpiece, which did something incredible and awful at some level, interpreting it. It established hierarchy. The other was completely open. Now there was hierarchy. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, the entire center section was closed off by McKimby and White. But the sidebars remain open. In Chicago in 1961, I.M. Pei did this incredible project called University Gardens in Hyde Park, which on both sides of 55th Street, 2,000 foot long. Imagine 2,000 foot long, parallel bars, slab blocks, were designed called University Gardens. And they're incredible, albeit that it's now, there's a hell of a lot of grown landscaping, but that he left it open-ended. Always, I was stunned by personally. These are the things that influenced me. And of course, Liu Kahn, oriented correctly, east-west, by the way, as was University Gardens. And the openness to the Pacific Ocean, the setting sun, and to see those 2, albeit crenellated, parallel bars of the Salk Institute, and then having the center filled with water, so you couldn't even inhabit the center. If you remember the incredible movie made by one of his children, Nathaniel, and there's a scene in the movie where he's rollerblading over that center body of water. I mean, it's an incredible moving experience and an incredible act of restraint by Kahn to not fill in the end of those parallel bars. So, when we finished early this year, 2 villas in Michigan that Margaret McCurry primarily and me secondarily did was the same thing. Only in this case, it's not only an absent center, that because they're self-similar, they're not identical, because they're for fraternal siblings. But each of those villas is in turn cleaved and has an open center, which is only there for vertical circulation or passing left and right to go to destination spaces. So these things have had a huge impact on me. Another one, which is in the show that Emmanuel put in up in the gallery, is a funerary monument for a client of mine who was Jewish, who was married to a Gentile woman. And the idea was to have each of their families on either side of this sheared, cleaved object in Rose Hill Cemetery in Chicago, oriented correctly. So the Jews oriented east, in anticipation of Messianic age, the Gentiles oriented west via the Cistercian monastic precedent. Now, in Judaism, of course, when you do, it's not just a simple cleaving back and forth. You open up a space, which when I designed this unbuilt project for a Reformed congregation in Metoa, just west of Lake Forest, the Chicago suburbs, of their synagogue, we found an existing log lodge oriented 6 degrees south of east, in other words, toward the west wall of Jerusalem. And I surrounded it by a fragment of Solomon's temple oriented due east, so that the differential between the two orientations that bracket the coming of Jesus, in other words, the east in terms of anticipation of Messianic age, and like the Muslims, oriented as a post-structuralist phenomena for the Jews back to the west wall of Jerusalem. So that led, ultimately, decades later, to my being commissioned to do the Holocaust Museum of Illinois in Skokie. And there was an interview process with a number of architects who, as often is the case, came to their various interviews with PowerPoint presentations, consultants, God knows what. I actually threw away the letter inviting me. I either got up on the wrong side of the bed that morning or whatever. Margaret, my good Episcopalian wife, with her entire rooming group from her senior year at Vassar, this Navy Wives Club, are all here tonight, okay? She insisted that I go. So I went to the interview after I was on a plane doing something, giving a lecture, and I made this sketch, showed the sketch, and an hour and a half later I was commissioned. And I then built it per the sketch. What's interesting about the sketch that led to this is that space of ineffability that was opened up due to the two orientations, which is only inhabited by an authentic 1934 German boxcar. In other words, it's not for human beings, it's for the deceased, which is what it's about. So it becomes, in a way, a space that only can be understood after death. The next section I want to talk about, Emmanuel talks about it in the exhibition as well, is scaffolding. Now, the scaffold is an interesting phenomena that up until recently, primarily, not entirely, but primarily is a sign, semiotically speaking, of a building going up or a building coming down. With this massive recession, it's taken on a new meaning. This is of a project by Joe Valera in Chicago that's been shuttered for nearly 5 years. There's another one in Chicago on the river that's about 23 stories in the air that's also been shuttered. In other words, the scaffold has another meaning now of the ambivalent condition representing what? Going up, coming down, or hovering in between. But the scaffold has precedent, antecedents in art and architecture. Interestingly, all in the same year, in 1923 and 4, 13 or 14 years after Frank Lloyd Wright had his seminal show that led to the publication called the Wasmuth Portfolio in Berlin, that was seen by all of the European architects of the day, predominantly Mies van der Rohe. But this painting by Mondrian is another example, in a way, of scaffolding. And these two images that you know very well, the one on your left, the building in Utrecht by Gerrit Rietveld, the Schrader House, the one on your right, an axonometric done by Theo van Doesburg, also in 1924, had a huge impact on me, such that when, in the late 80s, I was commissioned by Heinrich Klotz, then the director of the Deutsches Architecture Museum, as he commissioned a number of other architects to do an installation about man's original home. And Margaret and I were in Europe in the middle of a lecture tour, and I went to look at all, as I had the first choice. I picked a niche that was effectively unbuildable because it had 2 trees in it. And there was only one thing to do, was to measure the trees, orienting the scaffold toward Jerusalem. And as it was cut short to allow for the tree's growth, it was about the subject of measurement, which Emmanuel talked about earlier, which you'll see in that book that Michelle so kindly published, is also a great interest of mine. So the scaffold, the grid, the matrix, has been huge in my life, to the point when I did the Formica showroom at the Merchandise Mart, we did an incredible matrix oriented normal to the building and then shifted 6 degrees south of east toward Jerusalem once again, with, when it was cut, allowing you to walk through were all of the samples of Formica. So using every opportunity I could, I tried to engage that, as I did in Fukuoka in 1990, and the Fukuoka Jisho Momochi Housing Project. The one on the left is by Michael Graves. The one on the right I did, and you'll see a 2 by 2 meter grid on the outside that deteriorates as the building does, to not cast its shadow on its neighbor. But it's an item of measurement. I mean, the one thing that there is a certain innocence, maybe not so much for Saul Bellow, but for me, about the scaffold, about measuring itself. The concept of measurement. Not to steal your thunder, because I know next week you're giving a lecture on scaffolding. But scaffolding, or the grid, has loomed very large in my life as well, to the point that this project in Madrid, when Martha Thorne, now back in Spain, but in between coming to Chicago, when she was originally an expat in Madrid, she was head of the Cultural Commission of Madrid at a time when Madrid was the cultural capital of Europe. And she asked 5 different architects from 5 parts of the world to do an urban intervention. And when I went to Madrid to check out the sites that she'd assigned, none appealed to me, until driving by the Almudena, which is the major cathedral in Madrid, I discovered, to my horror, that the cathedral was misoriented. It's oriented not to the west where you can enter, it's oriented to the north, next to the Royal Palace, where there's a great statue of Philip II, so that the monarchy transcended theology. And it really annoyed me no end. And I decided to do a corrective. So with scaffolding, since so much of Europe is under scaffold, I reoriented. And finally, this project, which was in Chicago at the Spertus College of Judaic and Hebraic. I think Bibi, who's here tonight, was one of them that was asked. A number of us were asked to design a Sukkot, that temporal booth during the Jewish holiday Sukkot, and a fallen Catholic in my employ, Susan O'Brien, and a non-observant Jew designed it, working strictly from the Book of Seasons, the text. So this follows textually all of that. And again, it's a gridded scaffold done in transitory materials, temporal materials, bamboo. So that strategy of trying to come to grips with poetry, as it were, has been a huge part of my life. Now, the last section I want to talk about begins with obviously a pre-modernist condition, Palladio's Villa Rotonda, the building started by Palladio, finished by Scamozzi in Vicenza, where the building is bilaterally symmetrical. Now, buildings in a pre-modernist age were not just bilaterally symmetrical. The coining of their corners with dressed stone anchored them firmly into that tradition, which was a representation or a representation of the rooms beyond. That changed dramatically in 1910 with Frank Lloyd Wright's Vazimuth exhibition in Berlin, and then the portfolio, as exemplified here by the Roby House in Chicago. In other words, he broke out of the box. How do you break out of a box? You do it at the corner. You break out like so, if you can see, out of the corner. That had such an impact on the architects of the day, I can't begin to tell you. But no greater influence was felt than by Mies van der Rohe, who not many years later, in 1928, was commissioned on very short notice to design the German pavilion and the exhibition World's Fair of Barcelona. And Mies understood entirely, was moved entirely, in his own words, by Frank Lloyd Wright, not just in plan, but in elevation and section. So the roof is revealed as well. Frank Lloyd Wright, not to be outdone, in 1934 is commissioned by Edgar Kaufman to design this house, Falling Water, in Bear Run, Pennsylvania. Now, 1934 is 3 years after Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock co-authored the exhibition and catalog of international architecture, modern architecture, the international style. Wright did not play a major part in that exhibition, as did Schindler, play no part, was excluded entirely, largely because of their expressive qualities and the lack of the reductive modernist conditions that really were to Johnson exemplary of modernism. So here in 1923 and 4 is Mies's House for a Bachelor in brick. And if you notice the plan and the way that he's taken the Wrightian condition of that 1910 exhibition and what he's done with it is extraordinary. That had a huge impact on 2 generations of architects for sure, one of which was me. So that in 1959 and 60, in my bachelor's thesis, 2 things become evident. A plan which is anything but symmetrical, alluding back to Mies in many ways, but also an elevation which is asymmetrical in a pinwheel form, which was very crucial to exemplify that condition. Leaping far forward to today, Margaret and I were commissioned by the University of Chicago to move the seminary co-op bookstore to a place 1 block east of the theological seminary. We're moving out into a building immediately adjacent to the Roby House, which, if I can get this thing to work, is somewhere. The Roby House is somewhere to the right. So it's my opportunity to come to grips with Frank Lloyd Wright once again. And inside the bookstore are 6 figural voids, 3 simple, 3 more complex, but each of the 6 entered asymmetrically. In other words, the denial of centeredness. Now, all of this is in the context of our Hellenic Christian tradition of seeking ideality, seeking the Hayedokian aura, or, as Carla Britton has put it succinctly, ineffability. But that's the Western pantheon of values. There's another one, which is in part exemplified by the Loger Primitive Hut, written by Joseph Rickler in 1971. The entire book, with a very small section, with the exception of a very small section, is about architecture in the West with a small a. The small section in the book that's interesting, which is what I want to end with in a way, is he talks to the Japanese tea ceremony. And there is a tradition outside of this Western pantheon of beauty that's only understood in a Buddhist Eastern culture, which is called wabi-sabi, which is shown here in an image that I want to leave with you as the road not taken. Now, wabi-sabi is about something that we continuously deny, which is death. For wabi-sabi in the East, the condition that nothing is finished, nothing lasts, and nothing is perfect is actually understood and appreciated, where only death is what is perfect. So I want to leave you with that image, but in conclusion, on a lighter note, I want to call Bob up, because I have something for him, which is this last image, which is not about me. It's more about what's written by Bob Stern, which says, "Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done." And so it is.
Not quite, I hope.
Thank you, Robert.
You take some questions? Thank you, Stanley, for a beautiful talk and a modest talk.
Surprise.
Life is full of surprises. Stanley has agreed to take questions if there are any, and I hope there will be some. And we have someone with microphones, people with microphones on each side. So is there a question for Stanley? Peggy Deemer, down front, please. We need the mic because people will want to hear the question and the answer in the other rooms.
Thank you. I was impressed when you talked in the gallery about your commitment to symmetry, and that in some way you simply could not do it. And you showed projects here where you were breaking out, but even there, it's around a center, with the spiral, and so then once that becomes clear, I'm curious about the transition from a symmetry that is resolved and appreciated in the classical sense, and one then that, as you were saying, gets fractured and divided and is about the cleavage, where it really becomes about opposition, where really what you're showing off is that these two things, one, can't come together, and two, that the center is voided. So to me, that's not just a formal transformation, but as you're indicating here, is a kind of spiritual transformation. So I'm curious to know about that moment where the classical symmetry simply could not be maintained anymore, and you really were going, to me, what looks like it's opposite, even though it's formal, mirror possibilities are still there.
Well, actually, Peggy, I think each of us, how do I say this cogently? Because I've never believed in one overarching way to make anything. What I try to talk about tonight are the number of things, the 4 or 5 differentiated forces that have acted out in my life. the scaffold, the voided center, etc. And the asymmetry that Wright was the first to discover in 1910, say. So it's not just one thing that's had an impact on influencing the way I design buildings. I try to explain in this brief, quite about modest talk, the several things that have had an impact on me. As Emmanuel put it very nicely, both in the catalog and the introductions to the two books that I've written, and in his verbal description of the exhibition that he curated, I've never believed in one overarching correct way of doing anything. Now, having come from Chicago and a product of a Mies hegemony, it really had a huge impact, perhaps negatively, on my life as well. I never saw, because I'm not one for whom faith is uber alles, I've always tried to interpret. I'm more interested in exegetic operations about analysis. And so that's what this talk tonight, I'm just trying to express the different things that have had an impact on me. But one in terms of symmetry, because I could never quite come to grips with it spatially. My way was to cleave it. There are lots of slides I could have shown for sure that Emmanuel has in the exhibition, like the Berlin Villa, of breaking it into two, one of which Bob did, one of which Hayduk did, etc. In my case, using the Pearls House of 1909 by Mies van der Rohe, I cut it in two, as I said, during the gallery walk. I mean, if you're Jewish and you work in Berlin, you're not about to let it alone. So I wanted to cut it in two. It was a violent act. It was done very consciously, for sure. So, I mean, as I said also on the walking through the gallery, one of the reasons I have a small, if almost not discernible practice is because I've never said the right thing. Too many of you, like Patrick Pinnell, have sat on juries with me to know that that's true. So I don't know that it's an answer, Peggy, but it's the best I can give you.
I guess I was wondering whether was it not just it's either this or that, or there's not an overarching, but whether there's a narrative that as a linear narrative about that transformation, in or out or through. But I think you're explaining it as something.
Well, actually, breaking it up into the various components that Emmanuel did, it's Emmanuel's exhibition. Mm-hmm. I owe him a great deal, and as I've told him before I saw the show today, there's no way I can live up to that. I mean, he did an extraordinary job in curating, designing, and executing the exhibition, the catalog, and the two introductions.
And making sense out of you.
And making sense to the degree it's possible. No, Emmanuel is the one that we all, I certainly owe, a huge debt to. I think you do too, because it's a terrific show, and it's not about me. It's about Emmanuel. It's done something.
He may have sunk your career right now.
That's the story of my life. I'm trying to help his career, for Christ's sake. And in the process, I sink it. Is there another question?
Yes, Eduardo.
Thanks. I had a question about your use of color, and I was really struck by how when you were talking about the grid and the scaffolding, and you took us back to the projects of Rietveld and Van Desburg, the use they did of the color somehow also got into the way you use color in those scaffolding projects. And I was thinking, I wanted to ask you whether the way you use color with the scaffoldings is different in the way you use color in other projects.
Well, again, I've used color in a variety of ways. It's not just one overarching way. So, for example, the paintings that are on the wall of the gallery that I did in the mid-'60s in Chicago were entitled, as Emmanuel referred to in the exhibition walkthrough, I pledge allegiance to the lozenge and to the implications for which it stands. Obviously, it's a play on the Pledge of Allegiance in the United States. So it's at once cynical, but it's also red, white, and blue. Surprise. I've also used color in quite another way, like in the Library for the Blind. There are, basically, according to the Library of Congress definition of blindness, there's really only about, blindness is for people who have visual problems of 20% or more. So they can vaguely see color. So when I did the Library for the Blind, I used primary colors that would resonate with the blind user. That was very important to me. I've also used color on other occasions, representing earth, water, fire, etc. So, you know, I know that this is not within the traditional condition of architectural presentations where there's one overarching way to do something. I'm a kind of chameleon or Dr. Dolittle in a way of architecture. You know, because I never had one overarching correct way that I believed in, coming from a town that was one overarching way, and responding to it by being embattled by it has given me the freedom to do a lot of things. I know it may not be an answer that you like or you want, but I can only say it's the truth.
Fair enough. Other questions?
No.
Yes. Sorry.
Hi, Stanley. The image before the last image, which was the image which with all of the green, the seasonally changing image, you were talking about transitional adjustment, ephemerality. I'm trying to figure out what you were talking about, because one of the last times I saw you speak, you ended your talk by thinking about some criticism that you'd received for your work, critique in the press, essentially. And you essentially ended the talk by saying, to paraphrase you, that the best revenge against the critics is to create permanence in your buildings. You know, buildings that just never go away and change. So can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it comes, you know, I'm 10 years older than Bob, but he's also getting on. And I think when you age, when you near your end game, when you're near death, you begin to understand about what this Buddhist philosophy of nothing is finished, nothing lasts, nothing is perfect, which is very different than the Western pantheon of beauty, to which we've all aspired, to be at one with God at some level, to seek the ineffable, the unspeakable in a certain way. So that next to last image before this thing of Bob's is about that which you begin to appreciate as you near death, which is the imperfection in life. I mean, we all have clients, me too, who continuously seek perfection, continuously change their travertine floor, make everything clean, perfect. But nothing is that way. Everything deteriorates. But it's not in our culture to appreciate that in this Western pantheon of values. So it's really, as I said in brief, the road not taken. But that doesn't mean that I don't appreciate it or that I don't understand it. So Wabi Sabi, I would address everybody to look it up. It's quite interesting and very different from our sense of values, of ideality. Yes?
Tom Beebe has a question. This is going to be good.
Stanley. Actually, in all the years that we did shows and things together, I mean, I think the most amazing thing to me was your sense of humor. And actually, the humor ran into the architecture. If you could just talk briefly, because I think it's sort of a central theme in a way that runs through your life. How does humor, I mean, you're the only architect I know who actually seriously took humor seriously in buildings. And I think it's a very kind of powerful aspect of your work. And if you talk about it, I'd appreciate it.
Well, as Emmanuel said in the catalog, he also accused you of using humor. I mean, humor, from my perspective, is about approach avoidance. It's about the approach avoidance of death, that there is some ironic component. I mean, I'm waiting for Yale Press to publish his doctoral thesis from Princeton, Emmanuel Petit's, which is on irony. I mean, it is a major subject. Now, irony is problematic because it flies in the face of John Haydock's reducing distance between subject and object. By giving yourself distance, that making commentary about others and other things, you achieve some distance. But there is something humorous, ironic, in the face of death that we all, in various ways throughout our career, do it. There's no question about it. So I can look at drawings that Bob has made over the years that are also ironic, that are not so straight-laced. It's just that, in my case, well, for example, the Daisy House, which is something, among other projects, that Bob Stern has always said, how are you going to live this down?
Exactly.
It was done for a guy, as Emmanuel points out, who came to me dying. He came to me with a double colostomy. He had intestinal cancer. And I really didn't want to do the project.
Wasn't he a pornographer
I didn't know how
also?
to do it. Yeah, he ran strip joints in Cal City. It's my kind of client. It's what I get, sort of architecture with a small a. And I decided to make him laugh. So thus the Daisy House. He laughed, he loved the house, lived in it for 3 months and died. So is that ironic? Is it fair to engage humor in that way? I mean, these are open-ended questions. So Tom, it's hard for me to answer it as succinctly as I'd like, but humor is something I've taken, as you know, very seriously. It isn't just doing fun things. It isn't just, as Bob and I were reminiscing with Peter Eisenman earlier about the 1976 Venice Biennale that Peter put both of us and others in. It isn't just Aldo Van Eyck and Herman Hertzberger being thoroughly annoyed by my dirty postcards, which was off the wall anyway because it was an ironic commentary about American architecture. There is something serious about irony, and there is something serious about humor. Humor is not just jokiness. And there's a side of us that I've tried to capture in my work, for better and worse, in whatever limited talent I can focus on that, to express the ironic condition whereby we're here for this amount of time. There's a recent poem you'll read in the New Yorker of this African-American poet that talks about that we're here for just hours, maybe a day, and then we're gone. It's not something that one talks about all the time. So how do you approach the finite condition of temporality other than through irony and all of that? So, it's one of the reasons I, for one, was thoroughly appreciative of what Emmanuel did, his take on me at some level. Because nobody has actually ever done that before. And I really appreciated that irony and humor are not just fun subjects. Tom, I don't know if that really, it's played such a large part of my life that I don't know how else to answer it.
Have any other questions? Yes, but we bring the mic right down to the front.
Hello. A man of your experience, I'm just wondering what kind of advice you will give young students in these days.
What kind of what?
Advice for young students.
And also
advice that I have to students?
To the younger students, and also what's the secret of your success?
What was the last part of that?
What is the secret of your success? People think you're a success, Stanley. That's because you have a manual.
Let me correct that misapprehension. I don't see myself as a success. when you read the autobiography and why I became an architect and what I grew up with in a very poor household in Chicago, and a mother who equated success with money, I've done everything in my power through approach avoidance to not be a success. At some level, I've succeeded. So I suppose I am successful. My advice to students, you know, it's sort of like when I sat with Peter and his students earlier today, and Peter and I were talking informally about certain things in our past. And what I said to his students was that they need to get close to him and not have distance. They need to break down the barriers. It's what John Haydock said, to reduce the distance between subject and object. And when you do that, you can begin to understand irony. By the way, before I forget, the one thank you I didn't make was for these flowers, which is from Frank Gehry.
I told you what, Stanley's the only architect other architects like.
So thank you all very much.